By the mid-1960s, the Beatles were changing faster than any band in history. They were no longer satisfied with writing catchy pop songs or pleasing radio programmers. Every new single was a test of sound, of power, of how far rock and roll could be pushed without breaking. And in the middle of that transformation, John Lennon would later single out one record and say something unusually direct about it. He called it one of the best rock and roll records ever made. The song he was talking about was Paperback Writer. When Paperback Writer was released in 1966, it didn't sound like anything else on the radio. Most pop singles of the time were light, polite, and thin, designed to cut through transistor radios without much weight. Paperback Writer did the opposite. The bass was loud, the guitars were compressed and aggressive, the harmonies were tight but forceful, almost percussive. Paul McCartney pushed his bass line far forward in the mix, something almost unheard of in pop music. The rhythm section didn't politely support the song, it drove it. The result was a record that felt physical, muscular, and unapologetically confident. For Lennon, that mattered. Rock and roll wasn't supposed to be polite, it was supposed to hit. John Lennon was rarely generous when judging Beatles songs, especially those written primarily by Paul McCartney. He often dismissed Paul's more melodic or sentimental work as granny music or overly polished. That's why his praise for Paperback Writer stood out. Calling it one of the best rock and roll records ever made wasn't casual flattery. It was an acknowledgement that this record captured something essential about rock and roll: power, simplicity, and attitude, without dressing it up. Lennon respected how direct the song was. No metaphors about love, no emotional pleading, just a narrator declaring exactly what he wants, delivered with confidence and punch. That bluntness aligned closely with Lennon's own instincts about what rock music should be. One of the reasons Lennon admired Paperback Writer was how it used the studio not as decoration, but as a weapon. Producer George Martin and engineer Jeff Emmerich worked closely with the band to push the limits of recording technology. Vocals were compressed hard, guitars were treated for maximum impact. The entire track was engineered to sound bigger and heavier than anything else being released at the time. This wasn't experimentation for art's sake, it was practical. The Beatles wanted their records to dominate radio speakers, and they succeeded. Lennon understood that immediately. For him, this was rock and roll evolving without losing its spine. Unlike many Beatles songs of the period, Paperback Writer didn't aim for emotional depth or poetic ambiguity. And that was precisely the point. The song is confident, almost cocky. The narrator isn't asking for approval. He's presenting credentials. That swagger placed the song firmly in the rock and roll tradition, closer to Chuck Berry than to folk introspection. Lennon valued that clarity. He believed rock music worked best when it didn't apologize or over-explain. Paperback Writer knew exactly what it was and never pretended to be more. Over time, Paperback Writer has often been overshadowed by more experimental Beatles recordings that followed: Tomorrow Never Knows, Strawberry Fields Forever, A Day in the Life. Those songs redefined what pop music could be. But Paperback Writer did something equally important. It proved that power still mattered. It showed that the Beatles could push boundaries without abandoning rock and roll's core energy. And to Lennon, that balance was rare and valuable. John Lennon changed his opinions constantly. He criticized his own catalog relentlessly, sometimes contradicting himself from one interview to the next. But his respect for Paperback Writer never really disappeared. Because it wasn't about nostalgia, it wasn't about melody, it was about impact. In Lennon's eyes, Paperback Writer captured what rock and roll was supposed to be at its best: loud, confident, unapologetic, and impossible to ignore. That's why, years later, when Lennon looked back across the Beatles' catalog, this was the song he chose to single out, not as art, not as experimentation, but as rock and roll done right. And coming from John Lennon, that may be the highest compliment a record could ever receive.